The first thing you learn on a trading floor is that money does not care about the reason it moves. It runs to heat, like mercury gathering in the bulb of a fever thermometer. In Washington, the heat has often come from gunpowder, and on Wall Street the fever has often meant profit. That is not cynicism, that is bookkeeping. I was a young analyst when a senior partner told me that balance sheets go to war, long before soldiers do. He was right. In the spring of 1917, when the United States had hardly shaken the dust of neutrality from its boots, the Treasury asked the country for money, and gave it a patriotic name. Liberty loans, sold in parades and church basements, in small denominations and grand ones, turned ordinary households into creditors of a nation preparing for a modern war. The Federal Reserve System, still a teenager by institutional years, helped organize the selling machine, and taxes covered about a third, while borrowing covered the rest. Posters said buy a bond, but the ledger said build an arsenal. In Lower Manhattan, a syndicate house with a bronze door that looked like a vault's first cousin became something else entirely. J.P. Morgan and Company was not only underwriting railroads and utilities, it acted as the purchasing agent for Britain and its allies. A private bank turned quartermaster, sending orders across the Atlantic for everything from boots to bullets. The profits were fees, but the power was distribution. When a banker controls the spigot, the river learns obedience. When the guns quieted, a congressional drumbeat started. In the mid-1930s, the Senate Munitions Investigating Committee, remembered by the name of its chair, Gerald Nye, pulled executives into blistering hearings and made the phrase "merchants of death" a political thunderclap. The committee could not convict a motive, but it did map a network, and it taught Americans to connect dividends to deployments. The lesson faded but never fully died. The Second War industrialized the lesson. Franklin Roosevelt called the country the arsenal of democracy, then built a bureaucracy to match the rhetoric. The War Production Board rationed copper and rubber, decided what Detroit would stamp and what it would not, and turned civilian floor space into a lattice of machine tools. On another floor of government, Vannevar Bush organized the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a quiet ministry of minds that yoked universities to factories and gave the military radar, penicillin protocols, proximity fuses, and a $2 billion physics experiment that changed the species. The bomb's codename was Manhattan, but its true surname was mobilization. The financial architecture followed the materiel. To keep borrowing cheap while factories ran hot, the Federal Reserve kept rates leashed during the war, a policy unwound only with the Treasury Fed Accord a few years later. The public kept buying bonds, now called Series E, the so-called most widely held security of their age. Housewives and machinists became coupon clippers, not by speculation, but by conscription of sentiment. The point is not that debt financed war. The point is that war taught a republic how to love debt as duty. After victory, a general from Kansas stood at a lectern for a farewell and offered a phrase that still rattles like a keyring. President Dwight Eisenhower warned of a military-industrial complex, a triangle of incentives in which defense bureaucrats, uniformed services, and contractors could grow together and press the nation toward perpetual preparedness. He was not scandalizing industry. He was warning a democracy about path dependence. The language was plain, the implication was grand. A large permanent military and its suppliers could shape not only budgets but minds. The Cold War hardened the wet clay. The National Security Act reorganized the state, birthing the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Council. Then came a blunt policy paper called NSC 68, urging a muscular, open-ended build-up of peacetime defense. At the same time, the Defense Production Act handed the presidency an industrial steering wheel, allowing priorities to be set, contracts to be compelled, and supply chains to be rearranged by statute when national security rang the bell. Procurement became policy, and policy became procurement. Technology was the seduction. After Sputnik, Washington created a small, fast agency that treated research like a venture portfolio with a flag on the term sheet. That shop, eventually called DARPA, paid for moonshot after moonshot and left civilian breakthroughs in its wake. Microwave links, packet networks, stealth, machine vision, and a constellation of ideas went from grant to prototype to battlefield to the rest of us. A generation of engineers learned a new catechism. If the Department of Defense is the first buyer, capital will come. Business adapted with the reflexes of a prize fighter. A famous industrialist called Engine Charlie sat before the Senate and said something that would be misquoted for decades. He believed what was good for the country would be good for his company, and vice versa, and he meant it as a pledge, not a threat. But the sentence's echo stuck to the walls like cigar smoke, and it came to stand for the closeness of firm and flag after the war. The relationship is not conspiracy. it is structure. A company spreads its subcontractors like seed corn across as many congressional districts as possible, then invites the harvest. If you want the psychology, ask Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Humans fear losses more than they crave equivalent gains. Loss aversion, multiplied by television images and red maps, creates political consent for open checkbooks. Add the availability heuristic, our tendency to overestimate the probability of whatever we have recently seen, and a distant threat can become a permanent line item. Groupthink, as Irving Janis labeled it, packages dissent as disloyalty. Once that machine starts, appropriations become a ritual, not a debate. The Vietnam era taught bond desks a new language. The Treasury introduced freedom shares, an odd cousin to Series E, and payroll windows became patriotic turnstiles. Meanwhile, a different sort of accounting, made infamous by a trove called the Pentagon Papers, revealed the inner arithmetic of escalation. Secrecy can hide an overrun for a fiscal year. It cannot hide it forever. Markets eventually price everything. Then the century turned, and fear turned the gears. The wars that followed the attacks of early September poured appropriations through channels with names that sounded temporary, like overseas contingency operations, but the money behaved like a river that had found a canyon. By the early 2020s, researchers at Brown University's Costs of War project tallied budgetary obligations in the realm of $8 trillion when you count veterans' care and interest on the debt used to finance the fight. In the same period, private firms captured well over half of the Pentagon's discretionary spending, with the top tier of contractors absorbing sums that would dwarf the annual output of many countries. When the state went to rebuild a country it had bombed, logistics, contracts blossomed. Under the lock-cap framework and related awards, a few names became permanent fixtures on invoices and in hearings. Halliburton's KBR division drew scrutiny for cost-plus arrangements and scope that seemed to expand with every convoy, while other giants built airfields, fueled bases, and fed armies as if war were a bundle of services. Whether a bid was completed or not became a headline. Whether anyone else could have delivered at the same speed became the quieter question. The answer, more often than not, was that speed is a monopolist's favorite argument. Procurement did not stop at the water's edge. Arms exports became a tool of policy and a line of business. Through a program called Foreign Military Sales, the United States government acts as broker and guarantor between its own manufacturers and foreign treasuries, charging fees, enforcing standards, and shaping alliances with packing slips. In recent years, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has measured the country's share of global major arms exports at roughly 2/5, a dominance amplified by European rearmament and wars that changed procurement calendars from someday to now. Export control lawyers call it compliance. Balance sheets call it revenue. The costs at home are harder to see than a plant gate swinging open. A single aircraft program, the fighter that was meant to be everything to everyone, sprawled for decades and built local political armor state by state. The Government Accountability Office has warned again and again about sustainment bills that stretch far beyond airframes and into lifetimes. When you distribute suppliers across the map, you do not just spread jobs, you spread votes. You make cancellation an act of political courage, which is to say you make it rare. Meanwhile, the Defense Production Act hums like a compressor in the basement, rarely noticed until the floorboards shake, born in the Korean War, updated again and again. It gives the White House authority to prioritize contracts, allocate materials, and write checks to expand key industrial capacities. In pandemics, wildfires, or missile shortages, the same statute can be used to conjure factories out of thin air and to call capital to heal. It is the quiet proof that in a crisis, the United States still knows how to plan, and that planning, when tied to security, can feel almost like destiny. If you want to know how war became a business model in America, you follow the feedback loops. Universities feed laboratories, that feed prototypes, that feed contractors, that feed committees, that feed appropriations, that feed districts, that re-elect the committees, that feed the contractors. The loop is not a plot. It is an ecosystem. The inputs are fear, strategy, and employment. The outputs are hardware, software, and a sense of safety that is never entirely satisfied, because no market grows like the market for more. The psychology of investors lives inside this loop. We assign narratives to ticker symbols, because the human brain is a novelist that never stops. Fear stories command higher premiums than hope stories, because the penalty for being wrong about danger feels greater than the penalty for missing a blue sky. Out-of-authority bias, the way uniforms and seals on a podium reorganize our priors, and you get a discount rate that bends to the sound of marching feet. The foreign policy community will argue strategy, and they should. My job is capital, and capital must recognize patterns even when it dislikes their origin story. The pattern is this. Wars and the preparations for them create durable cash flows. Those cash flows create equities with low cyclicality and lobbying budgets that are rounded to the nearest senator. Research agencies seed tomorrow's margins. Export programs turn allies into customers and customers into allies. And emergency authorities keep the pipes pressurized when shocks arrive, which they do with the punctuality of human folly. Yet, even business models have ledgers with two sides. The costs of war work out of Brown reminds us that the bill includes decades of care for veterans, interest on borrowed trillions, and the opportunity cost of what might have been built if shipyards had welded wind towers, and if avionics technicians had wired the electrical spine of a new grid. No spreadsheet can hold grief, but budgets must hold obligations, and obligations compound. If you are an investor seeking the lesson, here it is with no romance. Know the statutes, know the committees, know which districts house which plants and which universities hold which contracts. Understand how loss aversion and availability bias shape public tolerance for spending. Read the GAO when it sighs about sustainment. Read CIPRI when it calculates exports. Read DSCA when it reports foreign orders and funding pressures. The model works because attention is intermittent and interests are permanent. But money also remembers the things people try to forget. It remembers that Eisenhower's warning was not just about factories, but about free minds. It remembers that every bond drive has a maturity date, and every cost-plus contract has a hidden price if competition dies. It remembers that once you mobilize an economy for permanent readiness, you do not simply build tanks. You build a politics that knows how to feed them. In the end, a nation is an investor with a very long horizon. It allocates not only capital, but character. The United States turned war into a business model by building the plumbing that makes war spendable, predictable, and saleable. It can also choose to turn preparedness into something else, to treat the same plumbing as a way to flood peaceful industries with liquidity and discipline. The statutes already exist, the labs already hum, the workers already know how to weld. The question for citizens and for markets is not whether war can be profitable. The question is how much profit we need before we call the ledger balanced, and whether we recognize the difference between a model that preserves the republic and a model that quietly owns it.